One day, a revolutionary government issues an order to building owners across the country. Anyone who owns commercial real estate must sell their property to their current tenants, and no one can own more than 100 square meters. If you own a building, you must sell all but 100 square meters. At what price? If the tenant pays 30% of the annual turnover for 5 years, that's it. In other words, commercial real estate can only be owned by someone who actually runs a business, and it is forbidden to collect only rent without labor. What would happen if this happened? Of course, private property rights would be severely challenged, and the government would be accused of being communist. But since there are far more tenants than landlords, especially in commercial buildings, landlord resistance is likely to be ignored as it has been in the past. In South Korea, the Land Reform Act has been enacted. In Korea, the Land Reform Act was instituted on the principle of farmland should be owned by farmers in 1949. Landlords were forced to sell all of their land that exceeds 3 hectares. If a peasant paid 30% of the rice from the land for 5 years, the land was his. Paying less than the rent for 5 years and the land is mine. The peasants couldn't believe their luck. Thanks to the land reform, Korea quickly transformed itself from landlordism to the society of independent farmers. Previously, no matter how much I worked, they could barely survive with the rent of up to 80% of their production. Now it's their land, so any increase in production directly went to their pockets. Japan's land reform was carried out from 1946 to 1950, after World War II. The main objective of the reform was to dismantle the feudal landlord system and foster smallholder farming. A key part of the reform was the government's purchase of absentee landlords and land above a certain size and redistribution to smallholders. This dramatically changed the rural structure of Japan, with the proportion of smallholders dropping from about 46% in 1945 to about 10% in 1950. The land reform significantly reduced income inequality in rural Japan and improved agricultural productivity, providing an important foundation for Japan's rapid economic growth. The Japanese example of land reform also influenced land reform in South Korea and Taiwan, and is considered one of the important elements of the East Asian economic development model. That made people work harder. The agricultural output was maximized, and because now people have surplus production, which became their savings, the market economy was slowly formed. Today, we're introducing you to a book that explores why East Asia's 3 largest economies have grown apart from Southeast Asia over the past 50 years. How Asia Works is a book that is particularly famous because it was recommended by Bill Gates. Bill Gates didn't just recommend the book. He's working on a project in Africa with the book's author to use what he learned to help solve poverty in Africa. The author argues that land reforms played a major role in Northeast Asian 3 countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China, in their transformation from agricultural societies to industrialized ones. The book had earned even more publicity when recommended by Bill Gates. The book is somewhat similar with Germs, Guns, and Steel, GGS in its attempt to figure out why some parts of the world is richer, but while GGS explored the imbalance over the globe in a time span of 13,000 years, this book only focuses on what has created economy gaps in East Asia in the last 50 years, which makes the book more relatable to Korean readers. I'll be introducing the author's claims here. Fortunately, the economic policies of Korea is well explored over the book, and I'll dig deeper into Korea's case later on. But today I'll be summarizing the main arguments of the book, how poor agricultural countries become rich, for those who are curious. Well, the first step is land reform. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Usually, before industrialization, 3/4 of the population are farmers and all they know how to do is farming, so it makes sense to maximize output in agriculture. Then what's next? If you think about it, there's also a logical next step. What would happen if rural productivity rises? Now you have surplus food, so you'll have more children like our grandparents' generation. But the rice paddies are all occupied so that when the kids grow up, many of them will find themselves without their own land to cultivate. In other words, Land reform is just a temporary measure, and you need to create more jobs for those who migrate out of agriculture. But there's a catch. New jobs have to be jobs in factories. Why not office jobs? Can't I work in an office with air conditioning? No, you can't. India thought otherwise and paid the price. As you may know, India has gone from primary industry to tertiary industry. They were like, let's not bother with manufacturing and just jump to IT. But IT is not an industry that creates a lot of jobs. The whole point of IT is to hire less people by making machines work. In 1991, 20 years after India launched its current reform agenda, less than 1% of the labor force were hired in IT. As a result, we don't get to see made in India products often, and now the country is nurturing its manufacturing industry. So it has to be factories. But there's another caveat. The factories have to sell not only to the domestic markets, but also to the international market. Because after all, the domestic market is still small, but overseas markets are filled with big consumers, and the potential is practically limitless. If you somehow produce what sells internationally, new orders will be flooded, hence mass employment. In other words, in order to create jobs for many people, you should go EOI, export-oriented industrialization, not ISI, import substitution industrialization. Like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China. The limit of the ISI model is apparent in Southeast Asian countries, like Thailand, that consistently walked the ISI path. When a country is nurturing business with subsidies and protection, many businessmen choose to win government licenses and concessions to get into protected business, like power generation, telecommunications, and casinos. Even when they manufacture, selling only to the domestic market makes more sense because imported goods are expensive because of tariffs, so that domestic consumers are practically forced to buy from them. In other words, if they are left to choose what they want, they don't volunteer to compete internationally. As a result, there won't be much technological progress in the country. In Southeast Asian countries, big corporations are telecom companies, domestic consumer goods companies like snack companies. It is like they have SKT and Lotte, but not world-beating competitors like Samsung, LG, or Hyundai. How have Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China avoided this? Export discipline. According to the author, governments have cajoled large corporations, or, in the case of South Korea, forced them to participate in certain industries that benefit the country as a whole, not just large corporations. If the state provides cheap loans and state support to large exporters, they will compete internationally and improve the quality of their products. Since exports go through customs, it is difficult to manipulate export figures, and even if you weed out poorly performing companies, you can still inject public money into companies that are internationally competitive. For example, half of the top 10 conglomerates in the 60s had disappeared through forced merger and bankruptcy by the mid-1970s, and again, half of the new group had disappeared by the mid-1980s. And one important detail in export-led industrialization is technological learning. Just assembling imported parts is not what you want to do. Whatever way there is, learning, stealing, or reverse engineering, you need to thoroughly understand the technology and become independent from foreign firms. Then, technological progress will let you innovate on your own and launch your own brand, which opens a path to long-term growth. In other words, export-led industrialization is also a story of acquiring secrets. One of the arguments in the book is that developed countries now blame developing nations for infringing intellectual property rights and/or protecting the domestic market, but they were the same. Britain protected its wool industry in the 16th century, and France in the 17th century, and the US from the beginning to the early 20th century protected their markets. Germany learned from Britain, Japan from Germany, Korea from Japan, and so on. The author starts with, but once he laid down all the facts and reasonings to support his arguments, he declares there are many kinds of lies the government needs to be good at. After all, the idea of making money in international trade, in the ethos of free trade, while protecting the domestic market is quite self-contradictory. But it's just a start. The government should help companies acquire technology. Foreign multinationals won't just hand over technology to small domestic firms, so the government can intervene and guide foreign companies to transfer technology to local companies in return for their access to the domestic market. Again, this is a far cry from the free market economy in college economics class. The book introduces the stories of Korean companies such as POSCO and Hyundai Motors acquiring technology from foreign companies, and the stories of Korean entrepreneurs who listened to everyone but trusted no one. And then President Park Chung-hee, who didn't really trust the entrepreneurs but needed them to build the country. The author's criticism of developed countries' hypocrisy continues through Part 3. Part 3 is not really a step. It's that the government should intervene in the financial sectors to succeed in Step 1 and 2 effectively. You have to keep the finance system on a short leash and make it serve state development purposes. And here again, the ability to tell lies matters. If the IMF or the World Bank say things like opening up financial markets or deregulating banks, pretend you're listening but ignore it afterwards, until you've grown big enough. According to the author, no developed countries have ever started with a free market economy from its infancy, and the countries that have listened to free trade evangelists all failed in rapid economical transformation. Therefore, while it's tempting to listen to economists with fancy theories, you'd better open your eyes and see how what has really worked for countries before you, like Japan and South Korea, and follow the historically proven path. In other words, you should learn from history, not economics. It may seem to be just another socialist criticism of neoliberalism and mainstream economists, but it is not. From the beginning, he emphasized the inefficiency of socialist collective farms due to its failure to serve human motivation, and he maintains an empirical attitude not bound by any ideology. For example, he says the competition between firms, an important element of capitalism, is a necessary element to prevent rent-seeking activities of big corporations. In summary, we have 3 keys for success. First, land reform. Second, export-led industrialization with technological learning. And third, finance was used like a carrot and stick to achieve the first 2. The 3 East Asian countries of China, Japan, and South Korea have succeeded, but many countries in Southeast Asia are still a work in progress. Countries like Vietnam and India will grow in the future, so it's worth keeping an eye on them. If you liked this video, please subscribe and like it. Thank you for watching.